for our seminar.
So Angelos, for those who don't know, is actually my uncle and godfather.
Mm.
And academically, he is a professor in the School of Historical Studies of the Institute of Advanced Studies in Princeton. He specializes in Hellenistic history, and he's actually a historian and an archaeologist, and your go-to guy for epigraphic translations from ancient Greek. His fields of interest lie in social and religious history, the history of emotions, memory, and identity in the ancient world. He studied ancient history, archaeology, and classical philosophy at the University of Athens, then did his graduate studies at the University of Heidelberg, where he also obtained his PhD, and later on taught there as a professor and was also vice rector. He was associated with the New York University as a professor and acting chair of the Department of Classics for a few years. And he was also a fellow at the All Souls College of Oxford. I can hear an echo. Is there a I don't know.
Can everyone turn off their microphones?
He has also taught as visiting professor at the International Hellenic University in Paris, in Australia, and in China. He has written a lot of books and has been awarded numerous distinctions and awards, amongst which Doctor Honoris Causa here in Belgium at the University of Liège, and was made commander of the Order of the Phoenix in Greece. And I really had to mention that for all the Harry Potter fans. It's a real thing. In his spare time, he likes to cook, cycle, do puzzles, and in summer enjoys excavations in Turkey and sailing. Today's topic has the title From the Social Construction of Emotion to the Emotional Construction of Society, and we will discover this together.
Thank you, Mando. I hope that you can all hear me. Let me start sharing my screen. Just a second. Okay. I hope that you can now see my screen.
Yes.
Okay.
Perfect. We can see.
Okay, perfect. It's a great pleasure to talk to your group because I usually talk about emotions to historians, archaeologists, philologists. For a change, it's a good thing to talk to people who really know something about emotions. So, as you have already heard, I'm an ancient historian. I work with text and images, and I look very much forward to your questions. Let me start myself with a question. Why should anyone be interested in the emotions of the ancient Greeks? What is peculiar about emotions in the Greek world? First, the fact that the Greeks, unlike other cultures, personified and worshipped emotions. They made them divine beings, and by doing so, they recognized the power that emotions have in our lives. For instance, Eros, erotic desire, is not the god of love, as we usually say. Eros is love. Love is a god. Erotic desire is represented as a playful child with a bow that shoots his arrows that hit us as an external force. Emotions, in this understanding, are not born in us, they penetrate us. His brother, whom you see on this image, is another personification. Pothos, longing, the desire for something distant or lost. The Spartans offered sacrifices to another personified emotion, fear, phobos. And even gluttony, adephagia, allegedly had a temple in Sicily. I don't know why, perhaps because of the local cuisine. Phtonos, envy, is a very powerful god. A telling image of such a personification is provided by a mosaic in Antioch in Syria in the early 2nd century AD that aimed to protect a private house from envy. The envious evil eye is being attacked by animals, venomous creatures, and weapons. It is also threatened by the phallus of a dwarf. An inscription, Kai Si, you too, wishes anyone who could cast an envious gaze upon the house to suffer in the same way. A culture that personifies emotions is a culture that understands the power of emotions and also reflects on them. It is therefore not a coincidence that the very first word in Greek and generally in European literature is an emotional word, menis, wrath. The Iliad, traditionally dated to around 700 BC or a few decades later, does not have as its subject the Trojan War, as we sometimes think, or an episode of this war. The subject of the Iliad is an emotion. Sing to me of the wrath of Achilles is the poet's appeal to the muse, to give him the inspiration to give an account of the indignation of Achilles. The Iliad begins by explaining the cause of his wrath, an insult, describes the manifestations of his anger and the consequences. Achilles retreats from battle, and the consequence is the death of his friend Patroclus, continues with Achilles' return to combat, and finds closure in the mourning of the Achaeans and their Trojans for the fallen heroes Patroclus and Hector. With Iliad, we encounter for the first time in any known literature a fully developed reflection on emotions, their causes, and their impact. For these reasons, studying Greek culture without considering emotions is like cooking a Greek dish without olive oil. It is possible, but it does not allow the other ingredients to develop their full potential, and of course, it does not leave any strong impression. Given the prominence of emotions in Greek culture, it is surprising that until 2008, when I applied for a grant of the European Research Council, no one had attempted to systematically study this subject. When I submitted my application, I had to come up with a name for this project. Given the fact that social and cultural factors such as education, values, and social conventions influence the manifestation of emotions in ancient documents, but also given everyday experiences of how society evaluates or prescribes emotions. Think, for instance, of what is sometimes told to children, boys don't cry, and so on. All these are social prescriptions of emotions. I decided to call my project The Social and Cultural Construction of Emotions, the Greek Paradigm. In such applications, one is asked to indicate the expected results, the so-called deliverables. You have written applications, so you know what I'm talking about. And I was very much tempted to write, if I knew the results already, then I would not be asking for 1.6 million euros. But I resisted the temptation to write the truth and gave a vague response. At least in this sense, my project was a success, because I did learn something. The project allowed me to radically reconsider some of my assumptions. I had started believing that we study texts in order to understand emotions, and very soon I realized that it is the other way around. We study emotions in order to understand texts. I started with a question whether emotions as survival mechanisms have a history. For instance, the neurobiological manifestations of fear. Did they change in the last 100 or 150,000 years? But I ended with the answer that history has emotions and that feelings have a history. Not emotions, but feelings. That is the conscious perception of and reflection on emotions. This is what changes over time. And although there is no doubt that social and cultural parameters determine if and how emotions manifest themselves in text and images, and in this sense, society and culture construct emotions, I discovered that it is equally important and far less studied how emotions construct society and culture, how they are used to create fictions, to establish hierarchies, or to represent political and social relations. Let me give you a few examples concerning the latter, that is, how emotions shape society. Disgust is one of the most elementary, powerful, and least studied emotions. A classical case of how emotions can be understood as survival mechanisms. Disgust protects us from pathogens. But this emotion is also used to stigmatize political opponents, to enhance racism, to define transgressions, and to marginalize groups whose behavior does not follow generally acceptable norms. Disgust is socially important because it associates moral transgressions with physical dirt. This is why everyday insults such as shithole, eat shit, asshole, pissed off, and so on and so forth have a scatological or anal component. Disgust is connected with anxieties concerning the protection of a community or a social group from alleged external contaminations. This is why former President Trump called Africa and Puerto Rico, Haiti, shitholes. Another example, fear of divine wrath and punishment and hope for divine protection are the fundaments for belief in divine power. Affection is used to create the fiction of the ancient city as a big family, in which the elite plays the part of the caring father or son, and the people the part of the loyal dependents. This is why we have expressions, you are our father, he is the father of the fatherland, and so on and so forth. If he is the father, then you should obey him. Metaphors of love are used to represent the duties of a good citizen. And images of marital love and affectionate children aim to create the fiction of the royal court as a place of harmony and affection. So in the course of time, the project, the social and cultural construction of emotions, turned into the emotional construction of society and culture. Since this talk is for an audience coming from an entirely different field, I will try to avoid the analysis of very complex phenomena and instead give you a general survey of the questions that ancient historians ask, the methods that they use, and the results that they get when they study emotions in specific sociocultural contexts. Let me start with a quote from a psychologist. Emotion penetrates life. It is there as a subtext to everything we do and say. It is reflected in physiology, expression, and behavior. It interweaves with cognition. It fills the spaces between people, interpersonally and culturally. Above all, emotion is centered internally in subjective feelings. Like physical pain, emotion provides us with personal information that is integral to our well-being, or in the extreme, to our survival. Indeed, whether we realize it or not, emotions are everywhere. The central place of collective memory in the United States is the Washington Mall, filled with monuments dedicated to heroes of American history, among them Franklin Roosevelt and Martin Luther King. Interestingly, the quotes selected to be inscribed on their monuments concern emotions: fear, hope, love, hate, anger, anxiety, sorrow, desire. I saw here an example. Martin Luther King is presented as a stone of hope emerging out of the mountain of despair. In our world, the calendar here is articulated by means of celebrations that highlight particular emotions. The year starts with rituals that highlight hope. Valentine's Day is dedicated to love. 9/11 has established itself as a day of sorrow. Thanksgiving Day is a festival of gratitude. Christmas, one of joy. Easter, a celebration of hope. National holidays celebrate pride, and the gay community consciously designates its own celebration as Gay Pride. Collective manifestations of emotion are a visible and powerful motor of historical change. In our days, anger, indignation, and fear have emerged so strongly as major factors in politics that future historians might be tempted to designate the second decade of our century as an age of anger, and the third, the decade that has just started, as an age of anxiety, grief, and fear. Every historical phenomenon, from a war and a financial crisis to elections and an ecological catastrophe, every text, from a court speech to a recipe, and every object of material culture, from the Parthenon to a toothbrush, is directly or indirectly related to emotions, either being determined by emotions, aiming to arouse emotions, or stimulating affective memories. And I challenge you to name me one object that cannot be somehow related to an emotion. For instance, a cooking recipe is connected with a desire to have good food and the fear that your cooking may fail. The question, therefore, is not why historians should study emotions. I don't think that they have another choice, but why they have not done so for the greatest part of the 20th century. One of the reasons for banning emotions from history has been the tendency to dissociate emotion and cognition. But thanks to neurosciences and psychology, we now recognize the interdependence of attention, memory, emotion, cognition, and decision-making. This interdependence is alluded to in an article of the pioneer in brain imaging, Ray Dolan, published in Science on the 8th of November of 2002, the birthday of Alain Delon, and my birthday. The importance of emotion to the variety of human experience is evident in that what we notice, attention, and remember, memory, is not the mundane, but events that evoke feelings of joy, sorrow, pleasure, and pain. Emotion provides the principal currency in human relationships, as well as the motivational force for what is best and worst in human behavior. Emotion exerts a powerful influence on reason, and in ways neither understood nor systematically researched, contributes to the fixation of belief. I know that some of the views of Ray Dolan, for instance, concerning the importance of the amygdala, are controversial, but these three sentences opened for me a window for understanding ancient texts that reveal precisely this interdependence of attention, memory, emotion, and faith. Let me give you an example. Let's look at this dedication from a sanctuary of the moon god Mes, who is represented here. You see him on the upper register with his scepter in the hand, in a sanctuary of Mes in Asia Minor. The text reads, a scepter was set up, that is, this is an expression that designates the preventing cursing of future culprits. So a curse was made for the event that someone steals something from a bath, a gym, we would say today. When a piece of garment was stolen, the god angrily prosecuted the thief and made him, after some time, bring the garment to the god. This is what we see in the image. We see the thief carrying with his hands the garment and bringing it to the god. The god, through a messenger, ordered to sell the garment and to write the manifestation of his power, that is his miracle, on a stele, that is on a stone. The commemoration of divine indignation at the man who had ignored the curse, but also the commemoration of his suffering, instructed other people how to behave. The relief attracted the visitor's attention. The text presented a narrative of feelings. The narrative aroused the fear of God, and this led to faith in the power of God. We recognize here, and I could give you hundreds of examples, the interdependence of attention, memory, emotion, and faith, or attitude, belief, conviction. According to another widespread conception, emotions are in people. This approach underestimates the communicative and social functions of emotions and emotional display. Emotions are also between people, and as such, they determine the relations between people, they influence social interactions, and almost every aspect of public life, creating emotional communities. However, the main obstacle for historical research on emotions has been and still is the nature of the source material, texts written in languages that are not our own. However, emotional terms cannot always be exactly translated from one language to another, or from an early phase of a language to a later one. Language expresses individual experiences using codes, which the addressee will then have to translate back to his own individual and unique experience. When somebody tells me I am angry, I translate this into a Greek word, but I also translate it into my own experience as a Greek of what anger means. Unlike the psychologist or the behavioral scientist who can interview and observe people, the historian's principal media for the study of emotions are text and images. And only contemporary historians can adduce recorded sound and moving images, but even these modern historians cannot talk back to the subject. The people who have died 2,000 years and I study talk to them. The problem is that I cannot ask them any questions. We cannot be engaged in a dialogue. In our direct communication, we have various media to enhance and specify the emotional meaning of a verbal message. As a Greek, in order to communicate my anger, I may select one of the many modern Greek words for anger, θυμώνω, αγανακτώ, οργίζομαι, τσαντίζομαι. Or, to be far more effective, I can choose one of the countless and culture-specific metaphors and metonyms that usually defy any translation. Σκάω, I burst. Είμαι εξωφρενών, I am outside of my brains. Τα πήρα στο κρανίο, I have taken them on my skull. Έγινα Τούρκος, I became a Turk. Μου την έδωσε, it gave it to me. Είμαι εκτός εαυτού, I am outside of myself. We notice that these metaphors are extremely powerful media for the expression, for the direct expression of emotion. These metaphors imply loss of control, personality change, and evaluations. And these metaphors are culture specific for the Greeks, and they do not necessarily exist in other cultures. For instance, none of them exist in ancient Greece. But in order to communicate emotions, I can also change my facial expression, raise my voice, or use body language and gestures. And of course, unintentional physical responses, sweating, blushing, and so on, reveal emotions that we would have liked to conceal. Most of these additional media of understanding or expressing emotion do not exist when the historian deals with human beings who died 20 centuries ago. But in some cases, verbal media, such as the choice of the vocabulary, alliteration, and repetition, serve as the equivalent of a raised voice or a gesture. For instance, one of my favorite songs is Love Me or Leave Me and Let Me Be Lonely. You see here the repetition of L, the liquid sound of L, which almost puts concentrates everything on the mouth and the wet elements in the mouth in order to express desire. Let us take, for instance, a letter written sent by a master to a servant. The master notes that he had told his servant 1,000 times to cut down the vines. Now that the servant asked again what to do with the vines, he gets a reply that expresses indignation. I reply, cut them down, cut, 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 Kopson, 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 Kopson. There you are. I say it again and again. Here, the repetition is the linguistic equivalent of a raised voice, an aggressive gesticulation. In a grave epigram, repetition and the use of a synonym is the equivalent of an imploring voice. Stand by me as you pass by. Stand, stranger. Do not pass without noticing me. And the epitaph of a gladiator has him shout from his grave, see how I lie alone, monos, monos, alone, alone. I, the one who used to play and say jokes. That's all there is. The repetition of monos, alone, is the equivalent of a loud voice lamenting the isolation of eternal night. The remembrance of jokes and play strengthens the grief. There are more sophisticated cases of emotional arousal and display. In petitions and letters preserved in papyri in Greek and Roman Egypt, the victims of attacks or abuse complain that their abusers spoke words through their nose, or that they snorted, and this papyri remained unexplained for more than a century. In a dispute over property, a woman was attacked by a man, I quote, who spoke to my face through his nose, wishing to end my life. What is the significance? He spoke through his nose. Another woman involved in a case of divorce narrates how her husband attacked her, speaking many terms of abuse into my face and through his nose. When an official attempted to collect taxes, a man snorted his contempt for me and wanted to attack me. Only if we consider emotions can we understand this text, because we can identify the biological origin of this behavior. It is disgust. The feeling of disgust as a disease avoidance mechanism is accompanied by automatic physiological responses that aim at protecting the body from the intrusion of pathogens. These responses include changes in respiratory behavior, unpleasant sensations in the throat and the mouth, decreased skin conductance, reduced blood pressure, heart rate deceleration, and the wrinkling of the nose. This is why people speak through the nose. This is what I mentioned before. We do not study text to understand emotions. We need to study emotions in order to understand text. What these texts describe are not just facial and vocal expressions. They are displays of disgust in conflict situations. When indicators such as these are missing, the effort of a historian to interpret text as an expression of emotion resembles the effort of an opera critic to judge a performance by watching it on a TV screen with the loudspeakers turned off and reading the subtitles. But fortunately, an advanced, sophisticated culture had many subtle means at its disposal to communicate emotions. Wordplay, alliteration, metaphors, repetitions in text, and in the case of images, composition, body language, and gesture. My next example shows how these features work in certain contexts. This is a stone plaque that shows a child that holds a bird. His dog jumps up. I think it is a Maltese. Most of the ancient Greek dogs, or their dogs represented on stone, are Maltese dogs. They, for Mandó and Tassos, the Greek term is Melitinon, because the ancient name of Malta was Melitini. Anyway, so his dog jumps up, trying to catch the bird. The image shows a moment of joy. The child, as you can see, is smiling. And yet, the emotion that it intends to arouse is anything but joy. This representation is on a relief that marked the grave of this child, who died still a boy, by contrasting the joyful moment of a short life and the eternal grief of death. The image intensifies the sorrow of those who knew the boy and invites future viewers to feel empathy, to become part of an eternal emotional community of grief. The name of the child contributes to the bitterness of this scene. Polyiuktos means the one for whom many prayers were made, but prayers that remained unfulfilled. This image shows the difference between representation and display of emotion on the one hand, and arousal of emotion on the other. But it also shows that feelings can be understood only when we have some knowledge of the specific socio-cultural context. If I would ask someone who has never seen a movie to describe the first image on top left, she would say that it shows a young woman enjoying her shower. For the second image, you would say that it shows an open palm. And would you identify the third image, you would identify the third image as the last letter of the alphabet. Very few might say that it is the title of a French movie by Costa Gavra. Probably more might associate it with the sign of Zorro. The emotional meaning of these three images changes, however, radically the moment we consider society and culture. The first image is the iconic image of horror, the image of a woman about to be murdered. For the Greeks, who are now in their 60s or older, Zita is the symbol of a protest movement against conservative policies and the dictatorship in the 60s. And the third image is that of a hand raised in angry prayer for revenge. It is a symbol that often decorates graves of people whose death was attributed to murder for which the angry relatives requested divine punishment. In a different context, an open palm is an insulting gesture in the modern Greek munza and may cause fury. In another context, it may just be a warning that one has to stop. Exactly as these images, embedded in different cultural contexts, arouse or express different emotions, ancient Greek texts and images are embedded in the context of Greek society and culture, a society and culture that underwent dramatic changes from the time of Homer around 700 BC to the establishment of Christianity in the 4th century AD. I saw here some images of raised palms, palms raised in prayer or cursing. So this is what historians do when they say that they study emotions. They actually do not study emotions. What they study is the various factors that determine the manifestation of emotions, their expression, their control and display, their use in communication, and their use as a strategy of persuasion. They study the perception, display, arousal, and evaluation of emotions in specific historical contexts. For instance, the emotional responses to the loss of loved ones varies. It may be grief, but it may be hope for life after death. It may be pride in self-sacrifice, or relief at the escape from the pains of life, and so on. And this depends on factors such as belief in afterlife, philosophical ideas about the human condition, ritual performances, normative restrictions of mourning and the display of grief, concepts of self-sacrifice, for instance, martyrdom or sacred war, and the quality of life. Emotions are influenced by specific historical experiences, such as the impact of civil war on friendship, of HIV on sexual desire, of terrorism on tolerance, of global warming on hope for the future of mankind, of reality shows on the display of emotions. Historians study, for instance, how societies create emotional norms and make their members regard the display of certain feelings for instance, pride, as acceptable and discriminate others, for instance, grief or fear. How groups may define themselves as emotional communities, how under certain conditions a particular emotional climate characterizes a specific context. All these factors change from place to place and from time to time. Some of the media through which emotions are aroused are shaped by social agents and therefore are subject to change. Whether a burp after dinner will arouse the joy in China or the disgust of the host, or whether the tears of a statesman will arouse contempt or affection, all this depends on the values of a community. Therefore, the study of the social construction of emotions in historical disciplines that only have indirect or filtered accesses to emotions ultimately is the study of the social and cultural factors that continually affect the evaluation, control, arousal, and display of emotions. Oops, here. These were the questions that informed the project, The Social and Cultural Construction of Emotions, that I directed in Oxford from 2009 to 2013 with an ERC grant, and has produced 3 collective volumes and a very large number of articles. 3 concepts have emerged as useful tools for the study of the social construction of emotions in the Greek world. I will also mention 2 here: emotional regime and emotional community. An emotional regime is the way a society or a group creates emotional norms and makes its members regard the display of certain feelings, for instance, pride, as acceptable, discriminating others. Let me give you an example. A study on the frequency with which couples were observed to touch each other at cafes, that is publicly, showed that the touching happens 180 times in Puerto Rico, 110 times in Paris, and 0 times in London. This does not tell us anything about what people feel, only what society expects them to display in public. The second term, emotional community. Emotional community designates the shared emotional responses that are usually observed in gatherings dominated by prescribed behavior, such as a festival, a dramatic performance, a meeting of the assembly, a funeral, or a symposium. And the third term is emotional script, but I will not discuss this here. In the remaining time of my talk, I will present a few case studies of how one can approach text and images, taking into consideration the importance of society and culture. The historian Xenophon gives the following account of how the Spartans responded to the news that their army had suffered a great defeat in the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC. I quote the text. The messenger sent to Sparta to announce the disaster arrived on the last day of the festival of the Gymnopaediae. This is the greatest festival in Sparta, during the performance of the men's chorus. When the ephors, the highest magistrates, heard about the disaster, they were greatly grieved. So this is what they felt, as naturally one would expect them to be. However, they did not order the chorus to leave the theater, but instead they allowed them to finish the competition. Then they revealed the names of the dead to their relatives of each one of them. They ordered, this is emotional prescription now, they ordered the women not to cry out, but to bear their suffering in silence. On the next day, one could see the relatives of those who were killed going around with bright and happy faces, while you would have hardly seen on the street any of those whose relatives had been reported as still alive. And these few were making their way with gloomy expressions and downcast faces. This is a good example of how manifestations, not emotions, but manifestations of emotions, both individual and collective, are socially constructed. Sparta, as you know, is a metonym for courage and fearlessness and patriotism. In Sparta, a conservative, reactionary, military state that controls slaves, social and political institutions aimed to control and arouse specific emotions in order to defend the traditional political and social order from internal and external enemies. This is why the Spartans worshipped Phobos, the personification of fear, as a god. They didn't worship their fear, they worshipped the fear that they were arousing the enemies. They sent their young men out into the countryside during the night in order to instill fear on their free population by indiscriminately killing some of its members during the night. The Spartan mothers gave their sons, you see it here in a painting of Le Barbier, gave their sons a shield when they departed for battle, telling them, etan e epitaphs, it or on it, either bring it back or be brought dead on it. The Spartans, however, were not fearless, but in order to survive as a community, they were trained to fear their mothers more than the enemy. They were trained to fear disgrace and social death more than physical death. Fear dominated Sparta. The four most important aspects of the social construction of emotion emerge from this Spartan example: evaluation, control, arousal, and display, but also the emotional construction of the Spartan state, a state based on fear. Emotions entail processes and appraisal, which depend on social and cultural norms. Because emotions are subject to scrutiny and judgment, they can also be subject to normative intervention. In Greek culture, political and legal institutions clearly aimed at manipulating emotions. We saw that in the passage from Xenophon. Amnesty is an instructive case study. Greek popular morality expected from the victims of wrongdoing and their relatives to continually remember the injustice that they had suffered and to do everything in their power to inflict pain on their opponents. What was the result? The result were bloody civil wars for centuries. So the Greeks invented in the 5th century BC, this is really an invention, this is something that we do not know anywhere else in history. This is a very good example of how we can really pinpoint exact moments in history in which intervention in emotion and memory occurred. So the Greeks invented the notion of amnesty, amnesteia, a state intervention not on what people remember and feel, but on how they act on the basis of their memory and their emotion. By forbidding the memory of bad things, this is the word mnesikakein, remember bad things, and by banning anger because of bad memories, mnesicholein, a unique word, they intervened in memory and feeling. To ask a citizen to refrain from revenge meant to ask him not only to control affect, but also to neglect the duty to avenge the death of a relative. Amnesty required from citizens to give to the advantage of the living, to give to concord, priority over the right of the dead, priority over revenge. The Greeks imposed a hierarchy of norms and emotions. Concord and the survival of a community should be valued more than revenge. This was enhanced with rituals of selective memory, with festivals that promoted new forms of solidarity within the community, and in extreme cases also with intermarriages between the families of the enemies. Now another example for emotional prescription. When a local benefactor, when a local benefactor died in the city of Kyzikos in Asia Minor, a decree concerning her funeral stipulated that, I quote, all the inhabitants of the city, in one body, men and women, shall lament her. The decree does not refer to the citizens alone, but to all the inhabitants of the city. The totality of the population is reiterated with the word pandemei in one body. It is redundant. If you say all the inhabitants, it's all the inhabitants. You don't need men and women. If it's all the inhabitants, it's all the inhabitants. If it is in one body, it's all the inhabitants. But this redundancy endorses the prescription. The day of the funeral is marked. In this day, the entire city is to be transformed into a community of grief, like a big family. By inscribing the decree, the authorities of Kyzikos set up a memorial of that emotional community. Historians tend to believe what they read because it is written in Greek and Latin. This is a very big mistake. This text uses the emotions of grief and gratitude to create a fiction, the fiction of a grateful community and the loving member of the elite. It does so in order to conceal another powerful emotion, the emotion of envy, the envy of the poor. This is alluded to in an acclamation in Aphrodisias for a benefactor who had donated a building. By shouting, the text, envy will not prevail, the supporters of this benefactor, in fact, reveal what the prevailing emotion was among the population. Not gratitude for his donation, but envy for his wealth. Prescribed emotional community does not always work. In 2012, after the death of Margaret Thatcher, while some followed the norms of prescribed grief, others celebrated her death in the streets. Another example, this time concerning, again, fear in public life, the institution of ostracism, again, a Greek word that has been adopted in other languages, ostracism. Once a year, the citizens of Athens were asked to write on a postshirt, an ostrakon, the name of an Athenian who should lose his citizen rights and be exiled for a period of 10 years. If at least 6,000 votes were cast, then the citizen nominated by a relative majority was sent into exile for 10 years. This institution was justified by an emotion, the fear that the citizen might threaten democracy or betray his city. But fear was not the only emotion at play. Comments scratched on some of the ostraka suggest hatred, indignation, and envy. Get this, the traitor Menon is the king of idiots. An ostrakon against the leading statesman Kimon alludes to the alleged incestuous relation with his sister. Kimon, son of Miltiades, take your sister Elpinike and go. The drawing of a Persian archer, you can see it here in the middle of the screen, on an ostrakon against Callias, alludes to his sympathies for the Persians and the fear of treason. A man lying dead here on the left probably represents wishful thinking. The man who wrote the name of the hated statesman wished him dead. Such ostraka are the result of the collective actions of hundreds of emotional men who wished to inflict pain on an influential man because of fear, envy, anger, indignation, or contempt. The expression of emotions that took place during the ostracism was ritualized and therefore regulated. Ostracism was a process of decision-making in which cognition, the close screening of the behavior of public figures, was closely combined with emotion. Sometimes these ostraka were prepared in advance. If you look, for instance, at these two ostraka, they were written exactly by the same person. So they were written in advance and they were delivered to voters before the vote. Let's stay for a moment in the emotion of anger. When you Google the phrase anger in politics, you get 188 million hits. I did this morning. So this is when I gave a lecture on anger 10 years ago, it was only 114 million hits. So in the last 10 years, it has become 188 million. A study of context, developments, and parameters that determine the role of anger in politics is rendered impossible simply by the sheer mass of this evidence. However, if you conduct a search for the word anger and related words and expressions in a database on Greek inscription, you will find 150 cases. A disadvantage, the loss of a lot of evidence, becomes an advantage because we can look at each one of them individually and understand them. And then we understand that anger is not an emotion felt, but an emotion shown, manifested, displayed as the privilege of someone with a superior position. It is the privilege of a king who can demonstrate anger towards a subordinate community. It is the privilege of gods and other superhuman beings in curses. It is the privilege of demons in curses. It is the privilege of jurors in law courts. For instance, ancient orators do not display their anger. They want to make the judges angry. Let us look at a prayer in my next example here, in which an angry woman requests the mother of the gods to punish a thief. However, the woman does not reveal her anger. Actually, women in antiquity do not reveal their anger unless they are barbarian women, such as Medea, precisely because anger is the privilege of the superior. The woman is angry because someone had stolen her stuff. She writes, "I dedicate to you, mother of the gods, all the golden objects which I have lost." So since I have lost them, I can easily dedicate them to you, in order that you, the goddess, will investigate the matter and reveal everything, and in order that those who possess them will be punished in a manner worthy of your power, of the power of the goddess, and so that the goddess will not look ridiculous. The victim was probably a woman who not only suffered the loss of gold object, but also the loss of face. In order to motivate the goddess to act, she does not express her own anger, but instead wants to make the goddess, a superior being, angry. So she transfers the loss of face upon the goddess, thus urging her to reveal her power. The same strategy is applied in curses, which stereotypically threaten those who violate a grave with the anger of the gods. Taking such evidence into consideration, we can understand the function of the display of anger also in contemporary politics as part of a power play. Angry statesmen seek to establish a hierarchical relationship, and angry citizens seek to challenge authority. I will skip the subject of love. We may, for reason of time, let me mention my last example, how emotions were exploited to construct the fiction of humane slavery. When slaves made dedications for the well-being of their family and also included their masters in their prayers, they publicly performed affection and loyalty with an expectation of reciprocity. They do not express feeling. For instance, in an inscription from Aphrodisias, one reads, "I love Apollonius, my master." This is probably flattery or public manifestation of loyalty. Let's see some grave inscriptions for slaves. The first one, a group of slaves praised a fellow slave whose grave they erected as Philokyrios, affectionate towards his master. When Philokyrios, affectionate towards the master, is used as a praise or a personal name of slaves, it expresses the expectations of masters. It does not necessarily express the feelings of slaves. When the epitaph of the slave Manes, who died in Thasos, declares, "I was good, useful, honest towards my masters," we do not hear the voice of a slave. The slave has died. What we hear is the voice of those who wrote this phrase on his grave. The freedman Skeptikos was buried in Philadelphia in front of the grave of Archelos, his former master, probably with permission from the master's family. In the epigram, Skeptikos is presented declaring, "I, Skeptikos, the freedman of Archelos, lie here in front of the stone grave of a good master." Of course, the dead slave did not inscribe his monument. And another one, the epigram for Epitynchanon, a Nubian slave, a black slave of the supervisor of stone quarries in Antinopolis in Egypt. The stone presents the slave praying to the gods to reward the kindness of his master. the master who actually wrote this epigram. This is a common strategy of the composers of grave epigrams. They manipulate the voice of the dead in order to pass to the living the message that they want to hear, assurance that the deceased has gone to a better place, gratitude for the respectful treatment by the mourners, and so on. In the case of slaves, even in death, their voices were manipulated in order to express the values of those who owned them and exploited them. In the grave epigram for Bithynis, the Bithynian slave, a slave from Asia Minor, Poseidipos, a very wealthy poet, has the female slave assert that she preferred a grave near her master's to freedom. This is what the poem says. This is enough for the wise Bithynis to lie as a slave next to excellent masters. O Themis, I did not strive for freedom. I am well favored, I who possess a tomb that is better than freedom. Pure nonsense. Can we, however, recognize feelings when this material is shaped by theatrical display? We can, with the help of additional elements such as the detailed description of the bonds between master and slave, or incidents from the shared life or specific behaviors. Let me give you just one example, a truly moving epigram from Naples, ancient Greek Neapolis, that describes the close bond between two men, the slave Cosmos and his master Marcus Opsius Navius Fanianus. The latter not only manumitted Cosmos, but also provided him with burial. I read the text. This Cosmos here, well endowed by fortune, accomplished every happiness. My master placed me here with his own hands. He came to my grave shedding tears. You have to believe me. And he stood tireless near my dead body. Already when I was an infant, he longed for me. Being an infant himself, and now, showing piety, he buried me, an old man, another old man. The poet makes us eyewitnesses to an old man shedding tears for a lifelong friendship. It offers consolation, making Cosmos confirm from the grave that he had lived a long and happy life. The epigram does not conceal the social differences. The imperative, believe this, shows that the scene the poem describes was anything but self-evident. Let me skip something, and I move now to the end in order to have enough time for a discussion. In June 2010, as I was reading during a flight the conservative British newspaper Daily Mail, I only lay hands on this paper in airplanes because of the lack of alternatives, I noticed the heading, "It should be a life for a life." Then a 3-page long article in the newspaper reported of the reaction of the family of Millie Dowler, the 25-year-old victim of a mass murderer, when her killer was condemned in absentia to a lifelong sentence. The article continually refers to emotions, grief, anger, and hope. Grief for the loss of the young woman, anger for the fact that her killer could not be executed, and hope that his life in prison is a life in hell. The article does not address or even allude to the controversy over the death penalty in the United Kingdom, but an important subject in the agenda of ultra-conservatives. But it is clear that the intention behind this display of emotions is to win support for the reintroduction of the death penalty. We recognize here the same connections as in ancient inscriptions. For instance, an inscription on an altar in Asia Minor in the 2nd century states, "There is a goddess, Nemesis, the goddess of punishment, the goddess of distribution, therefore observe justice." Narratives of divine punishment written on stone and set up in sanctuaries, such as the ones that I show here, preserved the memory of past events. Their decoration with reliefs attracted the attention of pilgrims. The loud reading of the text aroused emotions, fear of divine punishment, hope of divine protection. This founded the belief in the presence and power of God, which guided decisions and actions. The text on the altar expresses precisely this connection. Look at this stone, attention, remember the punishment of others, memory, feel fear, emotion, and act justly, decision. The report shapes our memory of the incident. Through the display of emotions, it arouses emotions among the readers and provokes decision making. One of the most successful advertisements of banks is the one launched by HSBC a few years back. The ad shows images which may arouse different emotional responses because they are embedded in different experiences. The image of the newlywed is accompanied by words starting with the same letter, F. Fate, fear, fairy tale. One could think of several other F words, not the F word that you are thinking now, but frustration, future, family, fulfillment, fertility, and so on. The image of a carpet is defined as decoration, souvenir, and a place of prayer. Pointing to the heterogeneity of experiences and approaches, the bank's motto is, "What we learn from one customer helps us better serve another." This is precisely what historians do in general and when they study emotions in particular. What we learn about emotions in one culture and in one historical period help us understand another and sharpens our critical mind. Thank you very much for your attention and sorry for the long talk, but Mando told me that I can talk for an hour.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Chaniotis. Thanks very much to Mando for making this possible. It's really a privilege for us to, it's changed us a bit from our usual seminars full of graphs and that's different kind of data. So maybe I will give the floor to the audience. You can raise your hand or just talk if you have questions. Assad?
Yes, thank you for the talk. It's effectively mind-changing. It's different from what we are used to. And it's sort of like a journey into how archaeological finds and or text analysis help us understand how emotions are controlled by a society. But I have two questions for you. It seems to me that you have focused, because it's your specialty, on something that comes out when you analyze Greek archaeology and art. But don't you think that similar social control processes of emotions through literature, theater, sculpture, gravestones, inscriptions, songs, recited narratives or poetry could also be present in other cultures and societies precisely in order to prescribe or proscribe certain emotions or the expressions of certain emotions, or at least prescribe the rules for when and how to express these emotions? Don't you think that it's more of a general thing?
Absolutely. The difference, or what makes the Greek culture, in a sense, peculiar, I wouldn't say unique, because unique is an overestimated word, are certain factors that make it closer to our understanding. The Greeks, unlike, for instance, other societies, lived in cities. They had megacities. They experienced sometimes technological development, the rule of rationality, democratic institutions. They experimented with democratic institutions and so on. In this sense, they can be not a model. We do not imitate them, but they can trigger thoughts precisely because what they experienced is something that we can associate with, unlike, for instance, experience in medieval Europe, when everything were dominated in practically theocratic states, in which there was limited literacy. This is another important factor. In ancient Greece, we're talking about culture in which literacy was widespread. In ancient Egypt, you have texts, you have monuments, and so on, but literacy is, because also of the hieroglyphic script, which is very difficult, is limited to a certain group of an educated elite or professional scribes. These are the things that make Greek culture interesting. I'm not saying that it is the only culture or the more interesting, but this is what fascinates me in this material. It is the fact that I am dealing, especially when I study texts such as papyri or ordinary letters, inscriptions, graffiti on stone, and so on, the texts that do not necessarily reflect the experience and the thoughts of people in the elite. And this is a problem that we have when we study the textual tradition of the medieval ages. We hardly have any texts that reflect the thoughts and so on of ordinary people, and when they are reflected through other media, because they are reported by others who report what they felt, or even in the early modern period, or in the literature of the 19th century and so on. This is something that is located in particular segments of society. Whereas in the case of the Greek world, not in general, but in certain historical periods, we go through a very large, a very broad spectrum of social groups. It is one of the rare cultures of antiquity in which we even have the voices of slaves, the voices of women, and so on. And it is also, and this makes it also fascinating, a multicultural society. This is something that my fellow Greeks do not hear very gladly, because they think that the Greeks are somehow isolated. The Greeks were never isolated. The Greeks never lived alone. They colonized the Mediterranean. They imported slaves from other areas. They colonized the Near East. They received influences from Egypt, from the Near East, and so on and so forth. And it is precisely this multi-layered culture that allows us to study the factors that determine how society and culture may influence the manifestation of emotions. What I think is valuable is a dialogue between these the various cultures. It is the dialogue between a historian of ancient Greece and a historian of the medieval ages, or a historian of the 20th century. In the 20th century, we have two additional problems. One additional problem is the amount of evidence, which increases continually. When I imagine what a historian of the future will have to do, for instance, looking at Facebook tweets and so on and so forth, in order to study mentality and psychological responses to historical situations, it's a nightmare. Whereas we are in the lucky situation that we have a large amount of text. There are approximately 400,000 inscriptions and 600,000 papyri and a lot of literary texts, but they are there. They will not increase. We can study them, whereas the material from modern times is continually increasing. And then there is another factor, and this is actually what triggered the interest in the history of emotions. These are the books that prescribe behavior. This is a phenomenon that starts in the late 19th century, early 20th century. Books about how you should behave as a young girl, books of how you should behave as a gentleman, and so on. And this is a new form of emotional prescription that we do not find in other societies. And this makes, again, modern, the 20th century, an interesting case for the study of emotions. Okay. But the short, this was a long answer. The short answer to your question is yes.
Okay, thank you. I had another question. You started answering it partially when you talked about multiculturalism. It seems to me that when you do such analysis and such studies, you have both a large geographical span, but also a long time span. And the geographical span means that you have many different cities, and the time span is that you analyze texts or whatever form that you analyze through time and not just at one point in time. And there is an implication for that, and I wonder whether you have something to say about that. For the geographical span, it is possible that you could discover different rules for emotion expressions across different cities. And is this the case? That's one
Yes.
sub-question.
Yeah.
And the second is across time. Can you discover moments of change in the rules that could come out in these kinds of data that you have?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me start with the first question, whether we may discover differences from place to place because of differences in cultural background. This is the hard thing to do. And the reason is that in the periods in which we have texts from these areas, they are Hellenized. Superficially Hellenized. That is, they use the Greek language in order to express emotion. And this is already an imposition of one culture on another. So this makes it harder, although sometimes we can discover differences. For instance, in Egypt, texts written in Greek are far more emotional than contemporary texts written in Demotic, that is the local language and script. We have them from the same archives, the same areas and so on. And in the last volume that I edited, Unveiling Emotions #3, there is an article that shows exactly this, that private letters written in Egyptian are unemotional, private letters written in Greek are full of emotions. The second the second question, whether we can really discover changes over time, this is what actually motivated me in my research, because people can have subjective impressions of something, but what I wanted to do is to say, I have collected all references to hope over 700 or 800 years, and I can say something about it. And I can do it precisely, and this is the advantage of these interdisciplinary long projects and so on. They give you the possibility to have a project team that works in collecting the evidence. And let me give you two examples about this. The one example is the use of the word hope. Hope is a peculiar emotion. It's something between emotion and cognition because it presupposes thoughts. If I say I will move my hands and fly, I do not have a hope. I'm just stupid. I'm just stupid. You have a hope which is based on experience. I hope that tomorrow it's not going to rain because I make certain observations. So hope and fear are the two emotions that are closely connected with cognition. And we see a tremendous change, not in what hope means, but in how the word hope is used in grammar and syntax. In the early period, people have hopes. This is what they write in the text. I have the hope that, or I had hopes that my child will take care of me when I grow old, but my child died. So we find it very often in grave epigrams, the motive of the deceived hope. And all of a sudden, and I can date it exactly when this happens, it happens in around 30 BC or 27 BC. We see a different use of hope. People do not have hope. People receive hopes. They receive hopes from the emperor. Hope is used in order to establish, to shape the hierarchical relationship between the ruler of the world and the subject, and it is used by the subject in order to make the ruler do what they want. So they write, you are our hope. We expect hopes from you and so on. They never say we have hopes. And this is a case in which the representation or the use of an emotional term changes because the form of the government changes. And this is something that one can also observe in society with honorific inscriptions for benefactors, in which the people who honor them, set up their statues, say, you are the hope of the community. Well, this is indirectly a persuasion strategy. If you are the hope of the community, then please do not deceive our expectations, or you are the person who gives hope. So we see this transformation from I have hope to I am hope, the so-and-so gives hope. And this transformation is connected with a deep transformation of Greek society from more equalitarian, society to the rule of elites. And it also shows the increasing dependence of the people from the donations, the benefactions, and so on of the elite and the rule of the emperor. The second example in which one can see this is the use of emotional terms in public discourse. Until the year 308, there is not a single inscription in which an emotional, or a public text, a decree, a law, and so on, in which an emotion is named. And in the year 307, and this is the year when it starts, we find emotional terms in inscription. Again, it is connected with the importance of rhetorical education. People are educated, it's connected with the school of Aristotle, and how one persuades people by displaying emotions, manipulating emotions, and so on. And around this time, emotions are taught in schools. People learn how to present emotions. These are called progymnasmata. They are mock speeches, for so to say. For instance, speak as if you are Dido, abandoned by Aeneas. Which are the emotions that you are going to present? So the change in education, the change in rhetorical education, also changes the way people use emotions in public discourses. And I could give you other examples, but again, the short answer to your question is definitely yes.
Perfect. Fascinating, actually. Thank you very much. And I would like to add one thing. I really liked the part on amnesty. A very, very nice analysis. Very has many applications, actually. Thank you.
It's also very instructive. This makes us understand why amnesty actually fails. Amnesty failed in South Africa. Amnesty failed whenever, it also failed in ancient Greece. And these societies try to create a hierarchy of norms, and emotions prove to be much stronger. Memory and emotion proves to be much stronger than the legal endorsement of amnesty.
One more thing, if I may, Olivier, I'm sorry, but it's something ironic, but I want to say it. When you describe things like this, it makes me go back to what you started with. You mentioned at the beginning of your talk that emotions penetrate us, and they are not in us. But it seems that there is a reason for that. It's because people want to control our emotions. That's why.
Yeah. But interesting, in ancient representations, when we see emotions, it's always either God shooting his arrow. There's a famous vase showing, for instance, Medea killing her children. But the central person in this vase is not Medea. The central person is fury. The personification of fury is in the middle. It's an external power that overcomes. And another good example is Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great is continually mentioned in ancient texts that he was conquered. The greatest conqueror of all conquerors was conquered by his pathos, by his longing to do something. So this is part of the ancient understanding, but you are right about the modern implications.
Yeah.
Other questions?
Are there any other questions? Yes, Madhu.
Yes. So you just mentioned that emotions were taught at school, or at least the manifestation of the emotions. I just wanted to ask. I suppose that it's also linked in the way to how people use the terms of emotions. That I suppose that if different emotions were taught by the family than by the school, there's an evolution over there. But is there a way of knowing how it's linked to the manifestation, or directly, or not?
What the subject of these progymnasmata, or the handbooks of how to use your emotions in rhetoric, what the teachers of rhetoric actually teach is how to use, for instance, metaphors. It's usually it's something to do with the use of textual media in order to arouse emotion. Use metaphors, use metonyms, use alliteration. For instance, the repetition of pu, 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 the pu sound creates the idea of pain or pathos and so on. And they prescribe the use of gesture. And it was so important that these gestures were even remembered hundreds of years later. There is, for instance, a text that dates to the 2nd century AD that describes how Demosthenes used his fingers in order to show modesty. So this gesture is described, putting the fingers like this, bringing them to his mouth, down his chest, and doing this movement. So it is gesticulation. It's basically acting. It is not so much an analysis of emotion, but it is an analysis of how facial expression, body language, gesture, and the use of particular words, which I call acoustic signals, provoke emotions. And this is, again, an important subject that I didn't have the time to treat, is how ordinary words, absolutely ordinary words, become emotive acoustic signals under certain historical circumstances. For instance, in modern times, in German, the word Ausländer. The word Ausländer simply means a foreigner, but pronounced in a certain way and mentioned in a certain context, it is a term of contempt. Immigrant, for instance. If you are a Republican, the word immigrant is an acoustic signal for something bad and a danger and people getting our jobs and so on and so forth. The word liberal in the context of American politics designates something that is entirely different in another context. And we observe precisely this in the selection of certain words in Greek oratory that function as acoustic signals. For instance, the word homos, raw, which designates the barbarian, the uncivilized, and so on. We see it repeated in certain contexts. And this is something, again, that one cannot discover when one concentrates in one author, one text, and so on. But you notice when you have a good overview of both literary texts and inscriptions and papyri. And fortunately, nowadays, with the existence also of databases, you can do searches. For instance, when you suspect that such a word is used as an acoustic signal, you can prove it or disprove it by using databases. But the texts themselves, as it do not actually analyze emotions. The person who analyzed emotions is Aristotle, who is the founder of rhetorical theory, and also the only one who offers ancient definitions of emotions, but not all of them are correct. For instance, according to Aristotle, jealousy doesn't exist. It's not an emotion, it doesn't exist in his mind. And in many cases, I would prefer to, I would trust more the judgment of an ordinary peasant or farmer writing about emotions than the judgment of Aristotle. But modern philologists, like medieval philosophers, just believed whatever Aristotle said only because he said it. For instance, Aristotle thought that women have less teeth than men. And this was believed until the Middle Ages because it was written in Aristotle. People didn't open the mouths of their wives to count their teeth.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
Thank you.
That's fascinating. Are there any other questions? No? So maybe I have one last question, just about your work, more like in terms of how you develop this work. Have you already been working in collaboration with like psychologists or neuroscientists or other disciplines working on emotions? And I was wondering how the how you experience the dialogue with these other disciplines. It's not always easy. We have had experiences.
Yeah. Well, you already gave the answer. It's not always easy.
Yeah.
Do you want the diplomatic answer or the true answer? Now, the true answer is that whenever I have participated in conference with the participation of biologists, neuroscientists, and so on, first of all, I found myself lost because there were so many different opinions, ranging from Ledoux, for instance, emotions don't exist,
Right.
to another 169 definitions of emotions. And although, and I hope that I have tried to show this, when I talk to a psychologist, a biologist, and so on, I try to explain things in terms that he or she can understand. I don't see the same treatment on the side of the natural scientists. They try at the beginning, but at some point they just go on using terms that I don't understand. But what I have done is to extensively read articles and works and so on in psychology and the neurosciences, acknowledging the fact that there are extremely different views and ideas, but I don't read a book by a psychologist or a neuroscientist in order to quote it as the reflection of reality, of the absolute reality, but because it gives me so many thoughts. And I gave one example, the example from Dolan, for instance. If I hadn't read that article in Science, I wouldn't have realized how important it is to study in the ancient documents this interdependence between attention, memory, feeling, and faith. This opened my eyes and made me understand how the idea of the fear of God is created and promoted in society. It opened my eyes to realize how political arguments are made, and so on. It made me understand how the assembly works in the Athenian democracy, and so on. Whether Dolan is right about the amygdala or what he does in brain imaging and so on, to be honest, first of all, I cannot judge it. And second, I don't care, because my gain is not to understand how the brain works. My gain is to understand, to have a thought, to have a stimulus that makes me understand the text that I study. And I think that this is generally the value of theory. Theories are valuable and should be used when they let us understand something that otherwise we wouldn't have understood. And this is also what I tell graduate students and so on. Don't try to find a theory to apply on your material. Use theory or theories, but you shouldn't just take one theory and try to press it on your subject. It is far more rewarding to create theory. And this is something that I also discovered, for instance, the case of emotional community. The concept of the emotional communities existed. It was developed by Barbara Rosenwein, a historian of the medieval ages, who understood that groups, social groups in a very segmented society as the medieval society, function as emotional communities. The church is an emotional community, the army is another one, the monks, the court, the members of a professional association, a guild, and so on and so forth. But this concept didn't help me understand anything in ancient Greece. What it helped me realize is that I should work not in emotional communities in general, but ad hoc emotional community. That is how emotions are shared by a group in a marked situation under certain conditions. This is how I operate with theory, and this is how I am in a dialogue with psychologists and neuroscientists, not even trying to understand what they say, because sometimes I also lack the background, but trying to get ideas from this dialogue.
Okay, thank you very much for this very rich answer. It's very interesting to see the other side of the lens, because we also have had experiences collaborating with historians, and that was very rewarding, but not always easy either. So I think our seminar usually are 1 hour and a half. So I think we are at the end of the seminar, unless there is one more pressing question, but I don't see any raised hand. No, so before concluding, I want to convey maybe there are very kind and warm messages that you might not have seen in the chat. So Julie, for example, apologized for leaving, but says, I was truly, I want to say sincerely thank you for this talk. It was truly fascinating, and I'm grateful to have had the opportunity to hear something outside the scope of psychology. And I believe this feeling is really shared by many of us. We are an emotional community in this sense. So maybe let us open our mic and once more applaud Dr. Chaniotis.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was really a pleasure to talk, and thanks to Mado, who had the idea to invite me to the seminar. And when COVID is over and I'm vaccinated and can travel, I will really be very glad to have to visit your group
seminar with
talk
us.
to you.
Yeah.
Not necessarily in a seminar, but to have also unofficial talks about this extremely fascinating and important subject.
Yes, and maybe one more question. Do you, not about you talk, but several people would like to watch the seminar. Can we share the link of the seminar with people who are interested? You see no problem with that?
No. You can use the recording any way you like.
Okay, wonderful. Well, have a good day. I think